Why? Well, because bygones are bygones. I mean, the growth you've lost, and the jobs you've lost. So the question is, we must now look ahead. I think probably these revised figures indicate that the more pessimistic growth forecasts are more likely to be accurate. In other words, that for this year, as the Reserve Bank has indicated, they expect our growth to be something like 0.6%. But other forecasts are even lower. I personally think it might only be 0.3 or 0.2 for the year as a whole. Then next year, a little better. We hope that the drought will go away and a few other positive factors might kick in. So next year, we're looking at perhaps 1.3% and perhaps a little bit more the year thereafter. So I think that is really the growth scenario. So I wouldn't read too much into those revised figures. I simply say we've now got to be realistic about what we expect for growth this year and indeed next year.
Now, given the tepid world economic growth figures that we've seen and the lower commodity prices that we get to South Africa, how does South Africa generally compares with the growth league, so to speak, other emerging economies?
Well, if we take the most important price in our economy, which is the exchange rate, that's probably a very dominant one, our weakness there has been greater than quite a lot of the other developing countries, although we also get hit by the risk-averse movements that occur in the global economy. We always seem to fall a little bit further, and that's because of domestic factors. They sort of push us a little bit further. In terms of growth, we're at the bottom of the league at the moment. But let's look very quickly, for example, closer to home. In Africa, you have seen lately that Egypt has now displaced us as the second largest economy in Africa. I hope that's temporary, but nonetheless, we're now number 3 and not number 2, having being displaced by Nigeria earlier. And so those are new realities. Then in BRICS, I think, let me say immediately, the good news is, if you see it as good news, we're much better than Brazil. It's in a deep recession, minus 4% growth, great instability at the moment from a political point of view. So, and also Venezuela, which of course is really becoming a basket case. So compared with them, we are somewhat better. But the red lights have been flashing. They've been flashing in a way that tells us that if everything was okay, we wouldn't be talking about a rating downgrade now. So quite clearly, although we are not performing as well as we should in the so-called emerging market club, we should be doing much better.
How do we perform in the BRICS club?
Well, there I think we are not in the same league as either China or perhaps India, but more or less with, of course, Russia. I think our numbers look more or less the same, although the two economies are very different. But come back to my point, it is Brazil who is really the basket case as far as the BRICS club is concerned, not South Africa.
Now next week, it's a turning point for South Africa. We're standing on the precipice of a downgrade. What is our chances of a downgrade, perhaps by Standard & Poor next week?
Well, this is quite an important call. You know that, of course, Moody's did indicate 2 weeks ago that they were not going to change our rating. They are seen as one of the more optimistic of the rating agencies. We now wait for, of course, Standard & Poor and for Fitch. We're not quite sure when the Fitch rating will come, but the Standard & Poor one is the one that's enjoying most of the attention, because both Standard & Poor and Fitch are just one level above junk status. So if they change their rating, then obviously we're in trouble. We then are indeed downgraded, and that's something we want to avoid. And we're obviously putting quite a lot of effort into trying to avoid it.
Now, research by Standard Bank suggests that a downgrade will usher in a recession in South Africa. Do you concur with that statement?
As I said earlier with the growth figures, we're on the brink of a recession where you need 2 quarters of negative growth. Well, we're on the edge of that. We might avoid it, although some people will say it doesn't really matter technically. It feels like a recession. but that aside, I think the risks of a recession have obviously have to be taken into account and will rise if indeed we are downgraded by Standard & Poor, because it will mean higher borrowing costs, a whole negative image, something which we want to avoid if we can. So quite clearly, this decision is really quite a crucial one.
By now, haven't the financial markets already priced in the risk of a downgrade for South Africa?
To some extent, the financial markets have done so, Elvis. That's true. They've half expected it. And I think that we must add to that even if we're downgraded to say a junk status, our banking system is really quite resilient. So, I mean, that's not a problem here. It's the real economy. It's what it will do to growth, to employment. And you will see that the Standard Bank has also said that on a worst-case scenario, we could lose 200,000 jobs. So I think we mustn't shrug our shoulders and say, oh, well, we'll ride this out. I think it's fine. You and I can ride this out. But there are thousands of people out there who will either lose jobs or not get jobs if we can't turn this, really turn the situation around after whatever we hear next week.
Professor, what do you see as the major determinants or criteria that will swing or influence a credit rating agency like Standard & Poor about South Africa? Are these purely economic factors that they factor in, or are there political matters at stake here?
Well, let me just tick off what are the economic factors. They obviously look at your public finances. They don't want South Africa to fall into a debt trap. And so that's quite important, and the last budget made a very serious effort to avoid that, and the Minister of Finance has been putting that strong message to them in his own meetings with them. I think they also look at the growth prospects. They want to know, can you do better than 0.5%? Can you get to 2 and 3%? Because that will solve certain other problems as well. They look at labour stability as quite important, and they also look at policy uncertainty. That's been a great bugbear, and you've noticed that the words policy uncertainty have occurred in several of the reports so far, which we've had from the credit rating agencies. Standard & Poor have warned us. They said, we don't like the political noise, as they put it, in South Africa, whether it's the Pravin Gordhan issue or certain other issues, which will count in whatever decision they take in the next few days. They started off originally being very technical a few years ago, just looking at the public finances, debt ratios and so forth. But today you find that the credit rating agencies look at issues of governance. How well is the country being governed? Because that tells them whether the promises being made can be implemented, whether it will happen. So that is part of their evaluation and indeed of their scenario.
The NPA came out this week and stating strongly that they are not investigating the Finance Minister. Is that perhaps some certainty that's being left for the ratings agencies?
Well, I think that would be reassuring. I think that the jury's still out, if I can use those words, as to what might happen, but at least there have been some reassurances. It's just that for South Africa, in its particular circumstances at this point, we really must try and project an image of stability around the national treasury, around our finances. So we really don't want any disturbances on that front, while South Africa is grappling with some much bigger issues.
Finally, and very briefly, if you are a betting man, where would you put your money on for Standard & Poor's our rating downgrade next week, or perhaps leave it as is?
Elvis, I'm not a betting man, I'm an economist. What I will say is, a few months ago, I would have said 60-40, we will be downgraded. That's early in the year, but there have been some really positive things happening. You know, we've got rid of load shedding for the time being. There's been a relative period of label stability. We've had a reasonably good budget. So that's on the positive side. So I would say it's 50-50 as to what will happen next week. It's an even chance which way it will go, as far as indeed Standard & Poor are concerned.
Final thought.
I would say the next few weeks for South Africans, all indeed leadership in South Africa, it's a time for strong nerves and indeed cool heads. And whatever happens next week, we must have a plan B. That's what the nation expects.
That was not a betting man, an economist. Professor Raymond Parson from the Northwest University School of Business and Governments in our weekly slot of The Economy. But for more now on news and what's happening in the world of social media, let's find out from Renee.
And thank you very much.